Claire is horrified to find a man's fluid on her 8-year-old daughter Ella's clothes, with all evidence pointing to her own father, the man she once revered. The chilling truth slashes through her trust, marriage and family, dragging her into a nightmare she can't escape. Why would a grandfather do such a thing? Share your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned for the shocking twists. That morning, just like any other, the sun filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. Claire rubbed her eyes and listened to the birds chirping outside. It was a familiar sound, one that usually brought her a sense of peace. But not today. Today, there was a subtle tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. She had felt it for a while now, ever since her daughter Ella began acting strangely. But she brushed the thoughts aside, trying to focus on the daily chores that usually helped clear her mind. Ella, just 8 years old, was playing in the backyard, her laughter occasionally breaking through the silence. Claire smiled faintly, but there was still a tightness in her chest she couldn't shake. As always, she went about her morning routine, straightening up the house while keeping an eye on her daughter through the window. After losing her first husband, Ella's father, to a terminal illness years ago, Claire had thought her life would remain hollow. But then, Jake had come along. Jake, with his steady smile and calm demeanor, seemed like the perfect man to help rebuild the life she thought she'd lost. He was gentle with Ella, loving toward her, and eager to form a real family with them both. It had seemed too good to be true. They had married quickly, just a few months after meeting. But in the past few months, Jake had grown distant. His easy charm had been replaced with a cold, almost indifferent attitude, one that Claire found unsettling, though she tried to ignore it. Her thoughts drifted to her father, Christopher, who had been living with them since the death of her mother. He had once been full of life, an outgoing man who loved to tell stories, always the center of attention at family gatherings. But since her mother's passing, her father had become a shell of his former self. He spent most of his time locked away in his room, barely speaking, rarely joining them for meals. It was as if grief had swallowed him whole, leaving behind only fragments of the man he once was. Claire sighed as she made her way to Ella's room, where her daughter had left clothes scattered on the floor. It was nothing unusual for a child her age, but as Claire picked up the little pink shirt, something caught her eye, a strange, milky stain on the fabric. She froze. The cold, creeping sensation of unease settled into her bones, making her hands tremble slightly as she held the shirt closer to inspect it. It wasn't a large stain, but it was there, clear as day. A white, sticky substance. Claire's mind immediately began to race. It couldn't be what she thought, could it? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the horrible idea that had just flickered across her mind. "It's probably just some detergent," she muttered under her breath, though the explanation felt thin, even to her. She brought the shirt closer to her nose, hoping to detect a familiar scent. Maybe soap or food or something mundane. But no, the smell was faint, unrecognizable, yet disturbingly present. Her heart began to race, pounding harder against her ribcage as dread started to snake its way through her thoughts. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. Claire forced herself to take a deep breath. She was overreacting. That had to be it. "Don't jump to conclusions," she whispered to herself, trying to shake off the fear gnawing at the back of her mind. "It's nothing. It's just something weird from outside." But even as she said the words, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. That night, after Ella was tucked into bed, Claire decided to bring it up to Jake. He had always been the rational one, the calm in her storm of worries. As he walked through the door after work, She greeted him with a forced smile, feeling a pit of uncertainty forming in her stomach. "Jake," she began softly, holding up the shirt. "I found this in Ella's room today." He glanced at it briefly, his eyes narrowing slightly before dismissing it with a shrug. "Probably candy or something. You know how kids are. She's always running around, probably spilled something on herself." Claire bit her lip, her unease deepening. "But it doesn't smell like food or anything familiar. It's just strange." Jake let out a long sigh and shook his head, pulling the shirt from her hands and tossing it aside. "You worry too much," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's just a stain, nothing to lose sleep over." She nodded, though her mind was far from convinced. The way Jake had brushed it off so easily didn't sit well with her. He wasn't one to get worked up over small things, but this felt different. Still, she told herself to trust him, to put it out of her mind for the time being. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was nothing at all. But over the next few days, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Ella, once so lively and full of energy, had grown quiet, withdrawn. She no longer ran to Claire with stories of her day, and her once constant laughter had faded into silence. There were dark shadows under her eyes, and her usually bright smile had dimmed. That evening, Claire stood by the kitchen window, absently watching Ella out in the yard. The late autumn sun bathed the trees in a golden light, but instead of playing like she usually did, Ella sat quietly by herself, idly pulling at the grass. She hadn't smiled much lately. In fact, Claire couldn't remember the last time she'd heard that familiar giggle echoing through the house. Her brow furrowed with concern as she turned away from the window. Something was wrong. She had been sensing it for weeks now, ever since that first unsettling discovery of the stain on Ella's shirt. But it wasn't just that. There was more to it. It was Ella's demeanor, the way she had grown so quiet, so withdrawn. Claire could feel the dread creeping back in. She tried to brush it off, but the nagging feeling never quite left her. She had tried talking to Jake about it once more, but he had simply waved her off. "Kids go through phases," he'd said. "She's just growing up. Let her be." But Claire couldn't let it be, not when she could see the change so clearly. Ella wasn't just quieter. She was different. The sparkle in her eyes was gone, replaced by something dull and distant. And there were the bruises. Claire had found the first one a few days ago, a small bluish mark on Ella's arm, just below the elbow. She'd asked Ella about it, but the little girl had merely shrugged and looked away, her lips sealed shut. Claire hadn't pressed her then, assuming it was a result of roughhousing at school. But after noticing the same somber look in Ella's eyes again today, she couldn't help but feel that the bruise was more than just an accident. There was another one yesterday, on the back of her leg, and when Claire had tried to question her about it, Ella had gone completely silent. "Ella, honey," Claire had asked softly, her fingers gently brushing over the bruise. "What happened here?" But Ella had turned her head away, her little face closing off in that way children do when they're keeping something inside. "I don't know," she had mumbled, her voice barely a whisper, then hurried away to her room without another word. Now, as she stood by the window, Claire felt her stomach knot with anxiety. Something wasn't right. The stains, the bruises, Ella's withdrawal, it all pointed to something dark, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But what? And more importantly, who? Could it be someone from school? A teacher? Another student? No. She quickly dismissed the thought. Ella had always been a happy child, surrounded by friends, loved by her teachers, no signs of bullying, No warnings from the school. A noise from behind startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. Jake entered the kitchen, tossing his keys onto the counter with a casual clatter. He looked tired, as always, his shirt wrinkled, his face unshaven. "How's Ella?" he asked, noticing her staring out the window. Claire hesitated. "She's quiet. She doesn't want to talk much anymore." Jake sighed and rubbed his temples, clearly not in the mood for another conversation about it. "You're worrying too much again. Kids get bruises, Claire. It happens." Claire crossed her arms, her unease bubbling to the surface. "It's not just the bruises, Jake. She's not the same. Her voice trailed off, frustration tightening her chest. "She's a kid," he interrupted, more sharply this time. "Kids change. Stop making something out of nothing." "But what if it's not nothing?" Claire shot back, her voice trembling. "What if?" Jake cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Enough. I don't want to hear about it anymore. You're being paranoid." Claire flinched at the word. Paranoid. Was she? She didn't think so. The changes in Ella were real. She could feel it deep in her bones. The stains on the clothes, the bruises, they weren't just coincidences. But the look on Jake's face, the impatience in his tone, made her hesitate. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was imagining things, letting her anxiety get the better of her. "Jake," she tried again, softer this time. "Please, just look at her. She's not herself. Something's wrong, I can feel it." Jake's eyes flashed with frustration. "Drop it, Claire. I said enough." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Claire's throat tightened as she watched him walk away, leaving her alone in the kitchen, the weight of her doubts heavier than ever. She sank into a chair, staring blankly at the table. He didn't understand. He wouldn't understand, not unless he saw what she had seen. That strange white stain on Ella's clothes had haunted her for days. She'd found another one just yesterday, on a different shirt. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there, unmistakable. And it only added to the growing list of things that didn't make sense. Claire rested her head in her hands, her mind swirling with worry. She wanted to trust Jake, to believe that everything was fine, that Ella was just going through a phase. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. There was something else happening, something she couldn't see but could feel, like a shadow lurking just beyond her reach. And Jake's refusal to even discuss it only made things worse. He had never been one to get emotional, but his irritation with her concerns was unsettling. Every time she brought it up, he shut her down. Every time she voiced her fears, he told her she was overreacting. But she wasn't. She knew she wasn't. Something was wrong. And it was only going to get worse. The night weighed heavy on Claire, the silence of the house pressing in on her as she stood alone in the dimly lit kitchen. The shadows seemed deeper tonight, more suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She clenched her fists on the countertop, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions that had been swirling inside her for days. The test results had come back earlier that afternoon, and the truth they carried hit her like a cold slap to the face. She had hoped, prayed, that she was wrong, that her suspicions had been nothing more than paranoia. But now, standing there in the stillness of her kitchen, Claire felt her entire world shift. It was sperm. The white stain she'd found on Ella's clothes wasn't just a curious, unexplainable mark. Her hands trembled as she thought about it again. She had been hesitant at first, unsure whether to even have the stain tested. She'd spent days convincing herself it was nothing, that Jake was right and that she was overreacting. But the gnawing doubt inside her had been too loud to ignore. So without telling Jake, she had taken Ella's clothes to the lab, praying for an answer that didn't lead down this dark path. And now she had it. Claire leaned over the sink, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her mind raced, torn between disbelief and horror. Someone had violated her daughter, someone close, someone who had access to her. There was no other explanation. The thought made her stomach churn, bile rising in her throat. But who? The question hammered at her with relentless force. There were only two men who spent any significant time alone with Ella: her father, Christopher, and Jake. She shuddered, her heart clenching painfully at the thought. Could it really be one of them? She had no choice but to consider it. After all, there was no one else. It was either the man she had built a life with, the one she had trusted to be a father to her child, or her own father, who had once been a beacon of strength but had grown more distant, more troubled in the years since her mother had passed. Claire's mind swirled with memories, Jake's quick dismissals of her concerns, his frustration every time she mentioned Ella's behavior. And then there was her father, who had become so withdrawn lately, locked away in his own world of grief and isolation. He barely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words were clipped, emotionless. Claire sat down at the kitchen table, her fingers brushing lightly over the lab report, the paper cool and unforgiving under her touch. She stared at the words, as if hoping they might somehow change if she looked at them long enough. But the truth remained, cold and inescapable. Sperm. She had no idea how long she sat there, lost in her thoughts. But when she finally moved, it was with a slow, deliberate motion. She couldn't keep this to herself, not anymore. She had to do something. But what? Go to the police? Confront Jake? Talk to her father? The possibilities spun in her mind, none of them offering comfort or clarity. Claire sat in the living room, the weight of the silence pressing heavily against her chest. The house was dark except for the soft glow of a single lamp flickering in the corner. She could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the occasional creak of the house settling, but none of it could drown out the thoughts racing in her mind. When Jake came home, tired as always, he dropped his keys onto the counter and shrugged off his jacket, oblivious to the tension in the air. Claire stood frozen in the doorway, clutching the lab report behind her back, her hands trembling. She couldn't find her voice at first, couldn't even summon the courage to meet his eyes. But she had to say it. She had to. "Jake?" she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to talk." He glanced up, surprised by the tone in her voice, the heaviness that lingered in her words. He frowned. "What's going on? You look pale." She took a deep breath and stepped forward, holding out the crumpled lab report. "I had Ella's clothes tested, the stains, and it's sperm, Jake." For a moment, Jake just stared at her, the color draining from his face. Then, slowly, his expression shifted from shock to anger. He grabbed the paper from her hands, crumpling it slightly as he read over the words. "Sperm?" he repeated, his voice rising. "Are you serious, Claire? What the hell are you saying?" Claire felt her throat tighten as tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know what to think anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "Something terrible is happening to our daughter, and I don't know who to trust." Jake slammed the paper down on the table, his eyes narrowing. "And you think it's me, don't you? That's what you're saying, isn't it?" "No!" Claire blurted out, her heart racing. "I don't know. I don't know who it could be." Jake's face contorted with fury as he ran a hand through his hair. He turned away, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. Then, abruptly, he stopped and turned back to her, his eyes dark with accusation. "It's your father," he said coldly. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What?" she whispered. "Think about it," Jake continued, his voice dripping with venom. "He's been depressed for years, ever since your mother died. He barely speaks, he keeps to himself, but he's still a man. You know what I mean, Claire? He has needs. He's twisted. He's probably been acting out those perversions on Ella. Who else would it be?" The words hit Claire like a physical blow. Her father. The idea was so monstrous, so grotesque, that she couldn't even fully comprehend it. But as Jake's words echoed in her ears, something began to stir in the pit of her stomach. Doubt. Could it be true? Could her father, the man who had raised her with such love and care, really be capable of such a thing? I don't know, she stammered, her mind swirling with confusion. He's never. "Claire, look at him," Jake said, his voice softer now, almost conspiratorial. "He's not the same man he used to be. He's withdrawn, angry, isolated. You've seen how he's changed." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to reconcile the image of her father with the horrible accusations Jake was making. She wanted to reject it outright, to scream that it wasn't true. But hadn't she noticed the change in him too? He had become distant, cold. He barely participated in family life anymore, choosing to spend his days locked away in his room. And then there was the way he looked at Ella sometimes. Was there something there she hadn't seen before? Or was her mind playing tricks on her? I need to think, she said weakly, sinking into a chair, her hands trembling as she covered her face. "I don't know, Jake. I just don't know." "Look, I'm not saying we go to the police just yet," Jake said, his tone calming, as if he was trying to soothe her. "But you need to keep an eye on him. Watch how he acts around Ella. You'll see it. You'll see I'm right." For the next few days, Claire did exactly that. She watched her father, studied him from afar, noting every little detail. His quiet demeanor, the way he avoided joining them at the dinner table, the way he would retreat to his room and lock the door behind him. She scrutinized his interactions with Ella, though they were few and far between. Doubt gnawed at her with every passing day, twisting her insides until she could hardly stand to look at her father without wondering what secrets he was hiding. She hated herself for even thinking it, but Jake's words had planted the seed, and now it was growing, taking root in her mind. And then, one morning, while she was cleaning her father's room, something she hadn't done in months, she found it. Tucked away in the corner, under a pile of old clothes, was one of Ella's toys. A small, pink, stuffed rabbit that Claire hadn't seen in weeks. Her blood ran cold as she held it in her hands, staring at it in disbelief. Why would her father have this? Why would he keep it hidden? The doubts she had tried to push away came flooding back in full force. Had Jake been right all along? Could her father, her own flesh and blood, really be the monster she had feared? Her grip tightened on the toy as her mind raced. She needed answers. The house was still, cloaked in the deep quiet of the night. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the faint creak of branches pressed against the windows, making the silence even more oppressive. Claire lay awake, her heart pounding, her mind refusing to rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the small pink stuffed rabbit she had found in her father's room. It gnawed at her, filling her with an anxiety that she couldn't shake. She turned over in bed, glancing at the clock on her nightstand. The soft glow of the digital numbers read 2:13 a.m. Jake was fast asleep beside her, his breathing slow and steady. Claire envied his ability to sleep so soundly, so undisturbed by the horrors that had taken over their lives. Just as she was about to turn away from the clock, she heard it, a faint sound coming from down the hall. It was quiet at first, almost imperceptible. But then it came again, a soft thud, like something being knocked over. Her blood ran cold. Claire sat up, straining her ears to listen. The sound was coming from Ella's room. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet making no sound as she padded across the wooden floor and out into the hallway. Every step felt heavy, her heart racing as the soft noises continued, growing louder the closer she got to Ella's door. She paused just outside, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. For a moment, she hesitated, fear tightening around her chest. What if it was nothing? What if Ella had simply knocked something over in her sleep? But what if it wasn't? What if this was the moment she had dreaded, the moment her suspicions would be confirmed? Claire opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking slightly. The room was dark, bathed in shadows. Her eyes struggled to adjust, but she could make out the faint outline of a figure standing by Ella's bed. Her breath caught in her throat. It was her father. He was standing there, his back to her, leaning over the bed. Ella was asleep, her small form curled up under the blankets, oblivious to the presence in the room. "Dad?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Her father stiffened, turning slowly to face her. His face was pale in the dim light, his eyes wide with surprise, but there was something in his expression, something dark and unreadable. He took a step back, his hands shaking slightly. "Claire," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "Ella, she was crying. I was just trying to calm her down." Claire stared at him, her mind racing. His explanation sounded plausible. Ella often had nightmares. But why hadn't he woken her? Why had he come into Ella's room without saying anything? And why did it feel like something was off, like there was more to this than he was letting on? "I didn't hear her cry," Claire said, her voice tight, barely above a whisper. Her father swallowed hard, his gaze shifting nervously. "It was brief," he muttered, glancing down at the floor. "She's asleep now. I didn't want to wake you." But the unease that had been simmering inside her for days, weeks even, was now boiling over. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She watched as her father moved toward the door, his shoulders hunched, his steps awkward and hurried. "I'm sorry if I scared you," he murmured, before slipping out of the room, leaving her alone in the heavy silence. Claire stood there for a long moment, her pulse racing, her mind whirling with confusion. She turned to look at Ella, who was still sleeping peacefully. Nothing about her seemed disturbed. There were no tears, no signs of distress. But her father's sudden presence, his nervous demeanor, it all felt wrong. The next morning, the sun filtered through the blinds, casting pale light across the room. Claire had barely slept, her mind replaying the scene from the night before over and over. She got up, moving mechanically through her routine. She didn't have the energy to confront her father again, not yet. But as she entered Ella's room to gather her clothes for laundry, her eyes fell on the bed, and her heart stopped. There it was again, the stain, a small wet mark on the sheets, faint but unmistakable. Claire felt the familiar surge of dread rise in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. The stain was fresh. Too fresh. It hadn't been there the night before, she was sure of it. Her hands trembled as she touched the spot, her mind spiraling into panic. The thought made Claire's skin crawl. She felt like she was losing control, like the walls were closing in on her. How long had this been going on? How could she not have seen it? Claire's exhaustion and fear coiled tighter within her. She needed proof, something undeniable, something that would show her the truth, and she knew exactly how to get it. Later that day, when everyone was out of the house, Claire installed a small camera in the corner of Ella's room, hidden among the shelves. It was the only way she could be sure. She needed to see with her own eyes who was coming into her daughter's room at night. For the next several days, Claire checked the camera footage each morning, holding her breath as the images flashed on the screen. But every time, there was nothing. No strange visitors, no signs of disturbance. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time. As the days dragged on, the weight of her uncertainty grew heavier, and the sleepless nights began to take their toll. She felt herself unraveling, piece by piece, unable to find the answers she so desperately needed. She would have to wait. But for how long? It had been a few days since that chaotic confrontation with her father. Jake had been cold and distant ever since, barely speaking to her, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. But Claire could feel the tension in the house building, like something dark lurking just beneath the calm. And now there was another sound, another faint disturbance coming from Ella's room. Claire sat up in bed, her heart racing, her pulse quickening with a mixture of dread and determination. This time, she would catch whoever it was. She slipped quietly out of bed. The hallway was eerily quiet as she made her way toward Ella's door. The faint glow of the nightlight seeped through the crack under the door, casting a pale strip of light on the hardwood floor. She stood there for a moment, listening, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. And then she heard it. A soft shuffling, followed by a low murmur. Someone was in the room. Her stomach twisted with fear, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. Claire pushed the door open just enough to peer inside, her breath catching in her throat at the sight before her. Her father was there, standing at the side of Ella's bed. His back was to Claire, his movements slow and careful as he bent down, whispering something to Ella. The little girl's face was half buried in her pillow, her body still, except for the slight tremble of her shoulders. Claire felt a sharp pang of guilt. Was he truly just comforting her? Her father had always been gentle, especially with Ella, but now that simple act of kindness seemed tainted by everything she had been led to believe. "Dad?" she called out softly, stepping into the room. Her father jerked upright, startled by her voice. He turned to face her, his expression clouded with confusion. "Claire," he whispered, his voice trembling. Claire stood frozen, the familiar knot of dread tightening in her chest. "Why didn't you wake me?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "I didn't want to bother you," he mumbled, his eyes darting to the floor. "She calmed down. After a few minutes, I was just about to leave." Claire's eyes flickered to his pants, her breath catching in her throat when she saw it, a faint stain, barely visible in the dim light, but there nonetheless. Her mind raced, memories of the previous night flooding back with brutal clarity. What is that?" she asked, pointing to the stain. Her father looked down, his brow furrowed in confusion. I don't know," he stammered, his voice weak, his hands shaking slightly. Before Claire could respond, a loud thud echoed from behind her. She turned just in time to see Jake storming into the room, his face twisted with rage. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his eyes wild as they darted from Claire to her father and back again. "Jake, wait," Claire began, but he cut her off, his voice booming with fury. "No more excuses, Claire. This has gone on long enough." Without warning, Jake lunged at her father, grabbing him roughly by the arm and pulling him away from the bed. "Jake, stop!" Claire cried, rushing forward to intervene, but Jake was already dragging her father toward the chair by the window. He shoved him into the seat, his hands moving quickly, tying him down with a belt he'd pulled from the nearby closet. Claire watched in horror as her father struggled, his face pale with shock, his voice shaking as he begged Jake to stop. "Please," her father whimpered. "I didn't do anything. I swear." But Jake wasn't listening. His eyes were cold, dark with a rage that made Claire's blood run cold. "We're calling the police," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're done, old man." Claire's mind spun, caught between disbelief and horror. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. "Jake, please," she pleaded, stepping between him and her father. "We need to think. Just give me a moment." Jake glared at her, his chest heaving with anger. "You want me to wait? For what? So he can hurt Ella again?" Her father let out a soft sob, his head hanging in defeat. Claire felt a lump in her throat as she looked at her elderly father, tied up and lying helplessly on the sofa, waiting for the police officers who would arrive at any moment. His frail body seemed even smaller now, his face a mask of confusion and sorrow. Her heart ached, but she couldn't allow herself to falter. She had to stay strong for Ella. How could her father have done this to her little girl? Wiping away her tears, she steeled herself and made her way to Ella's room. Her hands shook as she powered on the laptop. The camera had been set up for days, but now she would finally confront the truth. The house was eerily silent, save for the soft hum of the computer booting up. Claire's heart pounded as she began to review the footage. She fast-forwarded through the hours until she reached the dark, fateful night. The video showed Ella's quiet room, bathed in shadow. For several minutes, nothing happened. Claire's pulse raced as she stared at the screen, dread creeping into her bones. And then, the door slowly creaked open. A figure appeared, barely visible at first, moving with deliberate silence. It was a man. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she watched the figure approach the bed. He reached for Ella, her sweet, innocent little girl, and grabbed her by the throat. The tightness of his grip was visible even in the low light, his hand large and forceful as it pressed down on her small neck, keeping her from moving. Ella's tiny body jerked in fear, and her muffled cries were faint but unmistakable. The man leaned over her, his breath heavy and strained. Claire's eyes filled with tears as the sickening scene unfolded. He held Ella in place, one hand gripping her throat, the other moving toward his own body. Then, in a grotesque display of cruelty, he began to touch himself. Claire's heart shattered. She had to pause the video, unable to bear watching any more for a moment. Her body trembled with rage, disgust, and an unbearable sorrow for her daughter. After gathering the courage to continue, she resumed the footage, her fingers cold against the keyboard. The man finished his vile act, and Claire watched in horror as his semen spilled onto Ella's clothes and bed. Her breath was ragged, her vision blurred with tears. She was about to shut off the recording, too sick to continue, when something changed. A faint breeze rustled the curtains, and for just a split second, the moonlight streamed through the window, casting a weak glow across the room. That's when she saw his face. Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her knees buckled beneath her. She stared in disbelief, her eyes widening in sheer horror. It was Jake, the man she had trusted, the man she had married, the father figure to her child. He was the one. He was the monster in her house. Her hands shook as she fast-forwarded the footage, skipping ahead to when her father entered the room. The familiar figure of her elderly father appeared, his movements slow, his face lined with concern as he quietly approached Ella's bed. Claire's chest tightened as she watched him kneel down next to Ella. Her father gently brushed the hair from Ella's tear-streaked face, his voice soft and filled with worry. "Why are you crying, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Ella didn't answer. She just sobbed, her little body shaking with the aftermath of the nightmare Jake had forced upon her. Her father looked lost, not understanding the true horror that had occurred, but his instincts as a grandfather kicked in. He wrapped his arms around her, cradling her small body against his chest. "It's all right, my little one," he whispered softly. "I'm here now. You're safe." His voice cracked with tenderness as he began to hum an old lullaby, the same one he had sung to Claire when she was a child. His deep voice trembled slightly, but it was steady enough to calm Ella down. Claire watched through the tears that now streamed freely down her own face. Her father's presence, his love and care for Ella, was unmistakable. Ella's sobs grew quieter, her breathing became more even, and within minutes she had fallen back to sleep, nestled against her grandfather's chest. Once Ella was asleep, her father carefully laid her back down on the bed and sat beside her, his body slumped from exhaustion. Claire watched as he sat there in silence for a few moments, his hand still resting gently on Ella's arm. Then he leaned forward, pressing a tender kiss on her forehead, whispering, "Sweet dreams, my love." It was in that moment, as he leaned down to kiss her, that Claire had entered the room, misinterpreting everything. She had seen him sitting by Ella's bed, his hand still on her, and the stain on his pajama pants. Now, watching the footage, Claire realized the terrible mistake she had made. The stain. It wasn't his doing. It had come from Jake. Her father must have sat in the same spot on the bed where Jake had left his disgusting mark. And in her panic, her fear, she had assumed the worst. Her father had only been there to comfort Ella, unaware of the vile act that had taken place moments before his arrival. He had tried to soothe her, to help her sleep after her traumatic experience, and Claire had burst in, accusing him of something unimaginable. Claire's body trembled with a mix of guilt, shame, and heartache. She had doubted him, her own father, while the real monster had been right in front of her the whole time. She had let Jake manipulate her, let his lies cloud her judgment, and now her father was paying the price for her hesitation. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, every beat heavy with rage and agony. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she realized the enormity of what she had just seen. She had the proof now, the horrifying, undeniable truth. And with all the sadness that consumed her soul, she knew what she had to do. She would turn him in. The officers had arrived. They entered the house forcefully, their boots thudding against the wooden floor. Claire hurried out into the living room, her heart racing as she saw Jake already speaking to them. His expression was carefully composed, though his eyes flickered with a nervousness he couldn't quite hide. "There," Jake said, pointing toward the corner where her father lay trembling, his hands still bound together. "It's him. He's the one responsible for everything. I saw it myself." The officers barely hesitated. They moved swiftly toward her father, grabbing him by the arms. His frail body shook as they pulled him up from the sofa. "Wait!" Claire cried, but her voice was lost in the chaos. The officers dragged her father toward the door, his old frame too weak to resist. His voice broke as he begged them to stop, but it was no use. They hauled him outside, his feet stumbling as they led him toward the waiting squad car. Suddenly, a scream erupted from Claire's throat, raw and desperate. "No!" The officers stopped, turning back to face her, confusion written across their faces. Claire's whole body trembled as she ran toward them, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "You've got the wrong man," she sobbed, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not him. It's Jake." The officers exchanged startled glances, their confusion deepening as Claire pointed back toward the house. Jake stood frozen in place, his face pale, his eyes wide with panic. "What? What are you talking about?" he stammered, but his voice lacked the conviction it once had. Claire wiped the tears from her face and held up the camera, the footage still fresh in her mind. "I saw it. I saw everything. Jake's the one." The officers looked at each other, their expressions hardening as they realized the gravity of the situation. Slowly, they turned back toward Jake, their hands moving toward their handcuffs. Jake's face twisted with fury, his mask of calm shattering as he backed away. "She's lying," he yelled, but the desperation in his voice betrayed him. I didn't do anything," Jake stammered, his hands shaking as he gestured toward the officers. "This is all a mistake." Claire watched in silent agony as Jake tried to twist reality, tried to lie his way out of the damning truth. The police officers stood around him, their expressions growing colder by the second. They had seen the video, and no amount of pleading would undo what had been captured on camera. Claire's knees felt weak, as if the weight of the betrayal was pressing her down into the floor. She wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out at him for what he had done, for what he had taken from her, from their daughter. But all she could do was stand there, her hands trembling, her breath shallow, watching the man she had once loved try to explain away the unthinkable. "Jake," she whispered, barely able to find her voice. "Stop." His head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with fear. For a moment he looked like the man she had known, the man she had married. But then his face twisted, the guilt and terror clear in every strained movement. "They'll believe me," he said, his voice breaking. "They have to believe me. I'm her father." "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head, her voice firm despite the tears that blurred her vision. "You're not her father. You stopped being that the moment you hurt her." Jake's face fell, his facade crumbling under the weight of her words. His shoulders slumped, and in that moment, the fight drained out of him. He knew it was over. There was no escaping what he had done. The police moved in swiftly, their hands grabbing Jake's arms and twisting them behind his back. He flinched at the cold metal of the handcuffs, but he didn't resist. He couldn't. The truth had been exposed, and there was no hiding from it anymore. Claire's heart broke as she watched them lead Jake out of the house, the man who had once been her husband, now nothing more than a criminal being dragged into the cold night. She stood motionless, tears streaming down her face, trying to grasp the reality of what had just happened. It felt surreal, like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But this was real. As the door slammed shut behind them, Claire collapsed onto the sofa, her body shaking with sobs. Her mind was spinning and her heart felt like it had been ripped apart. The man she had loved, trusted, and built a life with had destroyed everything. He had destroyed their family. For a long time, she sat there in silence, the weight of everything crashing down on her. But through the haze of pain, another thought surfaced, a thought that brought her both comfort and guilt. Her father. Claire's chest tightened as she thought about him, still tied to the chair, accused of crimes he hadn't committed. The guilt washed over her like a tidal wave, choking her with its intensity. How could she have doubted him? How could she have looked at her own father, the man who had raised her, and thought he could be responsible for such a heinous act? Her sobs grew louder as she realized the depth of her mistake. All this time, she had suspected him. She had let Jake manipulate her into thinking her father could be the monster lurking in the shadows. And her father, who had only ever wanted to protect and comfort Ella, had been wrongly accused, his love for his granddaughter twisted into something ugly by her own fears. Wiping her tears with shaking hands, Claire stood up and walked over to her father. He was still sitting in the chair, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with confusion and hurt. He looked up at her as she approached, his expression softening. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Her father didn't say anything at first, his eyes locking with hers. But then, slowly, he nodded. "You had to protect her," he said softly, his voice raspy with emotion. "I understand. You were afraid. We all were." Claire shook her head, the tears falling again. "But I doubted you. I let him make me doubt you. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for that." Her father reached out, his hands still trembling slightly, and gently took her hand. "There's nothing to forgive, Claire," he said, his voice filled with love. "You did what any mother would do. You were trying to protect Ella. That's what matters." Claire broke down, collapsing into her father's arms as the tears came pouring out again. He held her close, his frail body shaking with her as they wept together. It was as if the dam had finally broken, and all the fear, the anger, and the guilt that had been building inside of her finally came flooding out. "I'm so sorry," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. Her father pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Claire," he murmured. "I always will. We'll get through this. Together." For a long time they stayed like that, holding each other in the quiet of the house, the echoes of the past few weeks still hanging heavily in the air. But there was a strange sense of peace now, an understanding that, despite everything, they were still a family. They had been torn apart by suspicion and lies, but now, with the truth revealed, they could begin to heal. As the dawn light began to filter through the windows, Claire knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. Ella would need time to heal from the trauma she had endured. But Claire wasn't alone in this. She had her father, and together they would do whatever it took to help Ella recover. They would rebuild their lives, piece by piece, no matter how shattered they had become. And in that quiet moment, as the first rays of sunlight bathed the room in a soft golden light, Claire felt a flicker of hope. A hope that, despite everything, they would find their way back to happiness again. The morning sun filtered gently through the kitchen windows, casting a soft glow over the room. The warmth of it was a quiet reminder that, despite everything, life moved forward. Claire stood at the counter, her hands cradling a cup of coffee, watching Ella play in the yard. Her daughter's laughter filled the air, clear and carefree, a sound that had once seemed so distant, so impossible. It had been months since the nightmare that nearly tore their family apart. But now, things were different. Ella had been seeing a therapist, and slowly the brightness in her eyes had returned. The sessions had helped her heal, guiding her through the trauma with gentle care. She was resilient, stronger than Claire had ever imagined, and each day she seemed to grow lighter, more at peace. Claire's gaze shifted to her father, who sat on the porch, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched Ella run through the grass. His transformation had been just as remarkable. After everything, he had found a way to open up again, to let go of the pain and guilt that had weighed him down for so long. The quiet man, who had once withdrawn into himself, had become a source of strength and comfort, not just for Ella, but for Claire too. He waved at Ella as she ran toward him, her hair flying behind her. She threw herself into his arms, and he scooped her up, laughing with a joy that Claire hadn't seen in years. It was a simple moment, but it was everything to her. Claire smiled softly to herself. The road had been long, filled with moments of doubt and heartbreak, but they had made it through, together. The bond between them, once strained and nearly broken, had grown stronger in the wake of the tragedy. They had faced the darkest part of their lives and come out the other side, not unscathed, but healing. As she stepped outside to join them, Claire felt a sense of calm settle over her. There would still be difficult days ahead, but they had each other. That, more than anything, was enough. In the quiet moments, in the laughter shared between her father and daughter, Claire knew they would be okay. Hey everyone, thank you so much for sticking around until the end of this intense story. I know it's not an easy topic, but it's one that we have to talk about. If this story has taught us anything, it's the importance of protecting our children, whether they're girls or boys. As parents, we have a responsibility to always put our children first. We need to be their shield, their voice, especially when they're too scared or too young to speak up for themselves. In the story, Claire went through hell to uncover the truth and protect Ella, and although the journey was painful, she proved how vital it is to follow your instincts and never ignore the signs. No one else is going to protect your child like you can. And that's the hard truth. We can't assume that everything's okay just because it looks fine on the surface. It's up to us to ask the tough questions, notice the small changes in behavior, and make sure our kids know they're safe to come to us with anything. At the end of the day, this story reminds us that there's nothing more important than the safety and well-being of our children. Whether it's a son or daughter, we must be vigilant. We must be their protectors. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What would you do if you were in Claire's shoes? How do you make sure your kids feel protected? Leave a comment down below, and let's talk about how we can all do better to protect the ones we love. Thank you for watching, and remember, always put your children first.